Go, I will start going.
Okay, we're recording, so whenever you want.
Okay. So good morning to all of you all over the world. It's wonderful to be connected again from Georgia to Afghanistan, to the UK and to Italy and to many, many beautiful places in the world. I would like to say one thing that Pope Francis once said: in a time of crisis, please do not withdraw into yourself. If you close into yourself, you fall ill. And maybe to subscribe to that incredibly important appeal, we have imagined here at the University of Rome Tor Vergata, together with the students of the 8th generation of the International Master in Public Procurement Management, to create this new series of pills.
Il muto. Professore, il muto. Ha il muto. Ah.
No, I don't have the mute.
Ah, ok, adesso va bene.
Did you hear me?
Yes, right.
No, prima no.
Mai? Non avete sentito nulla?
No, gli ultimi 10 secondi.
Some of it.
Well, shall I restart very quickly? But I didn't have the mute on anyway. So anyway, let me again welcome everybody from Georgia to Afghanistan to Egypt, in the UK, in Italy. It's a wonderful occasion to get in touch with many, many friends. As I said, I wanted to quote Pope Francis, who said, in a time of crisis, please do not withdraw into yourselves. If you close into yourself, you fall ill. And these important words were basically probably our indirect background to create, together with the students of the 8th generation of the IMPPM, which I thank for their passion into following this initiative, to create these public procurement pills, which we hope will keep on going over these next weeks and months. I wish to thank Annalisa Castelli, Maria Cristina Cerri, and Andrea Polloni for the wonderful job that they have done in helping us creating this, making it possible also at the technological level. Before I introduce our very prestigious guest, let me just give a few hints. All the mics and the video until our guest speaks should be off. Our guest will speak for 30 minutes. And then once he has finished, the Q&A session, very important, for 30 minutes will start. At that moment, when you speak, raise your hand with your blue button, and I will give the floor to you to make a very short question, very precise, please, no long speeches. At that point, please put your video on, your microphone on, and introduce yourself. It is also my great chance to say thank you to all the guests, including the professors of IMPPM, like Roger Beaker, staff, Catherine Bernard, if she's here, and all the guests that are coming here to listen to our guest today. And also to say hello to Nicola Dimitri, who will be the next speaker for the next public procurement pill. Thank you for having accepted. But most of all, thank you for having accepted to be with us here today, to our first guest, Albert Sanchez-Graells, Professor of Economic Law at the University of Bristol. Albert, it is a great honor for us to have you here. It is a greater even honor for me, who has, as you know very well, and you will be able to confess, been trying to get you here in Rome for now 2 years. We've never been able for coincidences. And so this is one of the advantages of technology, to have finally made you here with us. Great honor. Albert is an expert of competition and public procurement law and policy. He has written a very important monograph, very well known, on public procurement and EU competition rules. He looks into also sectorial issues like in the health sector. Recently, he's been involved in a very important strand of research related to the impact of digital technologies like machine learning, blockchain, and the internet on procurement governance. He has a fantastic blog, which I would advise you, all of you, to look into, howtocrackanut.com. But today he's here with us to speak about a very specific subject, quite important, the EU Joint Procurement Agreement, how it does work and why the UK did not participate. We thank him profusely for being here. Albert, once again, thank you, and I give you the floor.
Thank you, Gustavo. Thank you very much for the invitation and congratulations on this initiative, which I think is really great, and it's going to allow us to stay in touch in the next few weeks and months. It's true that Gustavo has been trying to get me to Rome for the last 2 years, and unfortunately I couldn't accept, first because we had a baby, then because of my policy not to fly anymore for work. And I guess, as he said, this is one of the silver linings, that our sudden migration online is probably going to help me keep in touch with lots of friends outside of the UK that I would otherwise not see. Thank you all for being here today and participating. And thank you also for any comments that you may have and any questions. I've been warned that you're quite active and that you will challenge me, which is brilliant. And I look forward to the discussion. I will just try to keep the presentation short, maybe even shorter than the 30 minutes, so we have plenty of time to exchange views. When I chose the topic for today, I thought, well, this is now really burning in terms of novelties in the procurement scene, because this joint procurement agreement of the European Union is not particularly known. I must confess, I didn't look at it for a very long time until I started researching cross-border procurement for a specific paper, and I think it's quite unknown. So it's a nice addition to the syllabus of any program that probably is going to stay for a while. My goal for the next few minutes is basically to explore this mechanism and try to understand how it works. I don't want to bother you with too many legal minimal points. I will also try to broaden some of the considerations to a more economic or political economy perspective, and on that I would be happy to be corrected by professors Piga or Castelli or Dimitri if there's anything I say that is not accurate. I will then bog down into some of the more cross-border legal issues and try to compare it to the regime that exists under the General Public Sector Directive. And then I will also speculate, because that's all I can do at the moment, on the reasons why the UK did not participate, but also whether that creates a risk of illegality in some of the contracts that the UK has awarded. And this is something that particularly Pedro Teles is quite interested in, so I'll make some references to our ongoing discussion on that. Now, just by way of background, I would like to say that these are clearly unprecedented times in the application of EU procurement law. My memory only goes as back as the last 40 years, but I don't think there's been any other situation comparable. And I think one of the counterintuitive messages that perhaps is not coming across is that the system is perfectly ready to tackle with this situation from a legal perspective, simply because we have a deactivation clause. We have Article 32(2)(c) in the directive, which provides for procurement under extreme urgency or extreme emergency. And basically, the rules are that there's no rules. The only thing that the procurement authority needs to do is record the reasons why they think they are under an extreme emergency and keep that record. But after that, they can just take a purely commercial approach. And purely commercial means they can directly award contracts with no timescales, no minimum requirements for competition and indirect negotiation. And that's very, very clear in the European Commission's guidance from 1st of April. So basically, procurement gets out of the way to just let public buyers do the best they can. And that's quite interesting. That's something that perhaps takes a hurdle out of the practicalities, but also should move procurement out of the political discussion, but it hasn't. And why is procurement still relevant? Well, basically because of what the EU has tried to do to provide a coordinated response to this crisis. The EU has a main problem in public health, that is that they have very, very limited competences there. That's Article 168 of the treaty. But one of the things that they can do is create specific agreements between the member states for the coordination of specific aspects. And one of those agreements is the joint procurement agreement for the procurement of medical countermeasures, or GPA in JPA in short. And sorry, because we're all used to GPA, that stands for the WTO, but today JPA, or in my confusion, GPA, means the Joint Procurement Agreement. And that's something that the EU is really pushing for use. No, I don't think out of an interventionist approach, but really trying to make themselves useful. And I think the pragmatic approach of the EU is also seen in the very new RESC-EU stockpile of PPE, personal protective equipment, that they're trying to implement as a way of also trying to cope with some of the limitations of the JPA. Now, what is the JPA? JPA is mainly I would characterize it as a centralized and partially delegated procurement mechanism. I think it's centralized, basically. Okay, there's some students saying that they cannot hear. Can other people confirm whether they can still hear?
I can hear you loud and clear.
Okay.
I can hear you.
I can hear you.
I'm sorry, Nisar, that it's probably a connection issue. I hope you can hear sometime soon.
Yeah, I can hear also.
Okay. So basically, as I was saying, the basic design of a JPA is a centralized and partially delegated procurement mechanism. It's centralized in the sense that it creates a cross-border coordination agreement, and it's a purely intergovernmental or intercontracting authority agreement that creates a steering committee. So every country that is a signatory of the JPA has a seat in the steering committee, and then this steering committee is meant to organize the collaboration on a global or on a general approach. So it's about the management of the agreement itself. And then there are specific steering committees for each of the procurements. So for example, in the specific case of the ventilators, not all of the members of the JPA decided to participate, which means that there is a steering committee that is narrower, and it's only composed of the members that are actually going forward in every specific procurement. So in that regard, it's centralized because it brings together all of the member states that sign at the top level steering committee, and then it brings together all of the member states that participate in the specific procurement in that second tier specific committee. Now, the execution of the procurement, whenever the steering committee at the higher level decides a procurement should be brought forward, and then the second tier steering committee decides the conditions of the procurement, they delegate specific functions to the European Commission as the executive arm of this agreement. But the European Commission works under very tight control of the steering committee, the second tier one, and they require a number of approvals. So it's not a delegation completely to the European Commission. It's very limited decision making that the European Commission has. What they delegate is the carrying out of the procurement. And what's also important is that there is a specific separate evaluation committee that is appointed by the steering committee. So basically, this is just a way of funneling the decision making down for practical issues while keeping control at the higher level. And because the European Commission is the one carrying out the procurement, then the rules that apply to that procurement are the rules of the omnibus regulation, so the rules that apply to the procurement of the European institutions. And that's important because what that means is that given that the procurement of the European institutions is regulated in a way that is really very similar, very close to the directive that all the member states know, they already have a standard of rules that they can all rely on. And they know that whatever the Commission does, it's going to be 99% compliant with their domestic requirements, which is kind of important. I have just put there a link to a presentation from the original time when the JPA was approved, so that you can get some more detail on the basic design if you're interested. Now, what is this agreement for? And I think that the functionality is something that maybe we can discuss. But what I think is mainly about trying to create speed of procurement through centralization, and also trying to minimize the applications. So basically, instead of having 20 odd member states trying to carry out procurement for the specific same thing at the same time. I think what this is good for is just having one procurement procedure. Of course, it could generate buying power, or it could improve the negotiating position of the participating member states collectively, although this is something to be discussed, because this is only going to have an improvement on buying power to the extent that there are very large potential sellers. If all of the potential sellers are very small, the buying power already exists at the national level. But the second thing that is problematic here is that it tries to avoid the duplication, but it's not exclusive. So the member states are not prevented from carrying out their own procurement of exactly the same supplies or machinery, even if they are participating at the European level, which is a bit strange. And in terms of commitment to the mechanism, I think it can create some dysfunctionalities. The idea would be maybe to try to use this to avoid buyers' competition. And I think that's a problem that has been raised in many other discussions. So for example, you may have seen that Germany is now accusing the US of having sized illegally, they call them modern day pirates, some masks that were manufactured in principle by a subcontractor of 3M for the German police. And what happened there is that basically the American buyer paid 3 times what the Germans were willing to pay. To try to avoid this sort of buyer's competition and the inflation of prices that happens, that's also probably what the JPA is after. Maybe from a more solidarity perspective or a different understanding, it's also interesting to see that the JPA has specific measures to regulate how the supplies that are probably going to be limited or that will only come in drips and drabs are going to be allocated to the member states that participate. And Article 17 is quite interesting in that it basically makes the second tier steering committee decide the proportion of the supplies that are going to go to each of the member states. But then it allows the member states that participate to enter into bilateral deals so that they can swap their quotas, and they could even donate their quotas to any of the member states if they are facing a particularly dire situation. So I would say that's probably both for an external coordination in terms of buyer-seller relationships, but also an internal coordination in terms of more of the joint planning or joint reaction from a public health perspective. Now, if we look at who's in, and this is very important, absolutely every member state of the European Union is there. The UK signed while they were a member state, and they remain a signatory of the JPA. And there's 2 EEA countries as well, Norway and Iceland, that have joined. It's probably worth noting that the Nordic countries have really only joined in the last couple of months, as well as Poland. And this is important because you can only participate in the specific procurements from the date in which you have become a signatory. So for example, that means that the last few countries to join in the last couple of weeks cannot take advantage of the JPA for ventilators that was already awarded, but they could participate in any future further JPA for PPE again, or for more ventilators or anything like that. So now if everybody's in, the question is going to arise, why did the UK not participate? And I'll come back to that a little bit later. But as you see, it looks like the member states see value in at least trying to buy together. And that's why they have all joined. Now, some legal issues for those of you of more of a legal inclination. The first thing is that the JPA has a very strange legal nature. It's not an international treaty. It's not a mechanism of EU law. In as far as the European Commission participates, it's seen as a budgetary implementing measure of one specific decision that empowered the European Commission to do this. What that basically means is that the law applicable to the JPA itself is not the Vienna Convention on the Law of the Treaties, but it's EU law. And that means that all litigation is going to take place before the Court of Justice. So if a member state thinks that another member state has failed to honor their obligations under the JPA, or if the member states want to take issue with how the European Commission has conducted the procurement, then they will have to take that to the Court of Justice. Equally, because as we said before, the JPA means that the procurement function itself is delegated to the European Commission, and the European Commission's procurement is only subject to challenge before the courts, in the first instance, the General Court, and in the second instance, the Court of Justice. That also means that in general, all challenges to JPA decisions will have to be at the European courts. However, I have some questions about this, because each of the member states basically benefits from the decisions that the European Commission makes, for example, the award decision, and they all sign the contract with the contractor. And I wonder if some of the public law of each of the different member states could be such that it would allow for challenges at the domestic level. But this is something untested, and it's something maybe we can discuss a bit later. In terms of how the procurement is carried out, well, to put it simple, there's only 4 routes that can be taken: open, restricted, negotiated, or competitive dialogue. My sense is that most of the time this is going to be used for negotiated procedures, and I think that's the route that they have used for these efforts in the COVID-19 context. And there's basically 2 types of contracts that can be awarded: either a standard direct public supply contract that could be split into lots, or a framework contract. Now, what's important here is that the European Commission only interacts up to the point of decision on award, but the contracts are signed in a way that make every member state have a direct relationship with the suppliers, which also means every member state has to pay directly the suppliers, and that can create perhaps some issues depending on how things are allocated or reallocated through the procurement. That's something we will come back to. And what is the applicable law to those contracts? That's another very important point, and I think this is going to create perhaps quite a few difficulties, which is that the law that is going to apply to the framework or the direct contract is whatever those contracts say. So I would not be surprised if say in a JPA procurement where 27 jurisdictions participate, the choice of law of the contracts is such that every contract with each member state is subjected to the law of that member state and the jurisdiction of the courts of that member state, which means that in reality, we are not awarding one contract or one framework, but we are awarding bunches of contracts or bunches of frameworks. And that could make it quite difficult for some sellers to participate, or for some contractors to be interested in these contracts, because they could be putting themselves in a situation where they don't really know what the law is going to be demanding from them. So if we compare this structure to the more general rules on cross-border and joint procurement, what I would say is that the JPA is really an agreement on procurement only. So it's only an agreement on when will we procure together, which is whenever the steering committee decides, how, which is however the second tier steering committee decides, and through which rules, which is it's to subject this to the financial regulation of the European Union and the stewardship of the European Commission. But everything else is just up for grabs, which means that the only thing the JPA does is that it ensures that EU law applies to the agreement itself, and that only the Court of Justice has jurisdiction for disputes on the agreement itself and on the procurement in principle. But everything else on the legal structure is just left undefined. And that will depend on what the member states want to do and what's acceptable to the market. And for example, one of the things that they could decide is that there's a lead member state and everything goes through that member state and it then gets reallocated to others. That would be similar to what the examples that we know about joint cross-border procurement, such as the one for the Eurosystem, work. But they could also just decide to split it all along national lines. So this is something that's going to be interesting to see when we have more clarity. But the way it works, and I'm sorry to put up this graph that I developed for a paper, is quite complex, because what we see here, and I'll just try to point to a couple of things. What we see here is that the JPA basically creates this relationship between the different member states. And it will probably work through framework agreements, which means that one member state is going to have a framework agreement regulating its relationships with each of the suppliers from different member states. And this framework agreement would then allow the contracting authorities from that member state to draw from it. But it could also be that they structure it in such a way that the contracting authorities from the second member state can directly draw from that framework agreement. To give an example, imagine that they located everything under German law. So we have German healthcare CPV managing the framework agreement. All the suppliers have contracts with the German CPV, and then everybody else is drawing from it. This creates quite problematic legal relationships that I don't have the time and I don't want to bore you with today. But this is mainly what has not been regulated at the EU level. So Article 39 of Directive 2014-24 just leaves all of these things for the member states to decide, just like the JPA does. So what I think is that this is a bit of a uncharted territory of whether these are going to be legal complications of relevance or not going forward. And I know that there are some Italian central purchasing bodies that have experience in collaborating with France. So again, this is something that we may keep in mind for the future. But the question is, will we learn much from the JPA in terms of litigation and the limits to what the member states can decide what works, doesn't work in practice? And I would say probably not. I mean, it's a very difficult call, but I don't think there's going to be a lot of litigation in this context for many reasons. Just to be a bit cynical, because nobody wants to be seen as profiteering from the situation, for example. So I don't really see suppliers suing, and the member states probably will just pile money on anything. So I would say, in maybe a more politically correct way, that there's going to be very high-powered incentives to try to settle any dispute. So I don't think we're going to learn much about whether the courts accept this or not, or whether this is all in compliance with public law in the member states or not. Now, trying to say something about what happened in the UK. Initially, it was a bit bizarre because there were some questions about whether the UK could still participate in the JPA or not, given that they Brexit or we Brexited at the end of January. But the Commission confirmed that they could participate and that they were actually invited. The UK government initially said we didn't get the invitation. Then they said there was a miscommunication. And at least The Guardian has reported that there are minutes of the steering committee of the JPA where the UK had participated, at least on 4 occasions up to mid-March. So it's reasonable that the government is trying to say they didn't know about this. There's a positive decision not to participate. And the question is then, why would the UK government not want to participate in the collective effort? Could be that they thought it's pointless, could be. But I think there are reasons to believe that this was seen as an opportunity for industrial strategy. So this was seen as an opportunity by the UK government to try to boost some aspects of the industrial base. And in particular, there was one contract that is a bit weird. That is the one given to Dyson, a very prominent Brexiteer, to say it all. And the contract to Dyson is weird because it's a contract to a company that has never manufactured a ventilator. And even if they are teaming up with some engineering companies that have the ability, what they propose to sell the government is a ventilator that had yet to be designed, which means had yet to be approved by the medical authorities and had yet to be tested. So it is very likely that there's going to be a delay in the ability to put those ventilators into use. And in my view, that doesn't meet the requirements for emergency procurement. I think it's one of these things that professors don't explain because it's so obvious, but I think it's difficult to challenge that if you carry out an emergency procurement, it's because you have a very urgent need. You cannot wait for it. So if you carry out emergency procurement, it has to be for absolutely immediate fulfillment of the contractual object. And I think we're going to have to see if this is possible, but probably they're going to come in much, much later than the other companies that have been given contracts for ventilators in the UK. So then the legal basis for the award becomes unsafe. And this is something I would really like the UK Parliament to look at in detail and to engage the National Audit Office for a proper inquiry into all this. But let's see what clarity emerges in the next few weeks or months. Now, a few final thoughts. maybe just to finish the provocation and start with the questions and answers. I think that with all its challenges, probably the current situation is going to be a catalyzer of joint cross-border procurement, in particular in health. I don't know if at a pan-European level, but certainly I think some member states will try to look at bilateral or multilateral agreements under the JPA if the JPA doesn't deliver. I think that the legal issues, maybe they're going to be more visible, but I think they will still remain largely untested and unresolved. So I think we're going to have some research to carry out around this area in the next few years. And then the question remains, is this even big enough? So is the JPA and pan-European coordination sufficient? Or should we try to be more ambitious and create a similar mechanism under the WHO, so the World Health Organization, or some other institution, so that at least we have some coordination and we try to avoid these issues of sizing of shipments and other problems that we are experiencing, as well as a massive inflation in prices because of worldwide competition for buying those equipments. So basically, if you want to read a bit more in more detail, there are a few links here to academic journals and other papers theoretically on cross-border. I have also written a few blogs, and Pedro Teles has also engaged in this discussion. I have a coming up blog next week in the Bristol Law School research blog on some more general issues about what are going to be the challenges once the crisis subsides, but let's save that for the speculation for some other time. So this is what I wanted to say. Thank you for your attention. Of course, this is all the ways in which you can get in touch, and since you will not come to Bristol anytime soon, this is where my office is. So I just wanted to make you all a little bit jealous, and I'll leave it here and open the discussion.
Albert, thank you so much. Imagine, as of now, a big round of applause, because this was it was tremendously informative and extremely timely. I have tons of questions, but obviously I'm not going to be the one who speaks. I remember every one of you raise your hand with the blue button, and then be sure to put your video on and unmute your mic, and then introduce yourself with a very short question. I saw for a moment Nicola Dimitri that had a question. I don't know if he has disappeared from the screen. Is Nicola still here?
Yes, I'm here.
Did you have a question, Nicola? Because I saw your hand raised, but then it disappeared.
Yeah.
Go ahead, very quickly.
Thank you very much. Yes. I would have, well, first of all, it was a tremendous presentation, Albert. So I really enjoyed it very much. I agree with Gustavo. It was very informative. We actually dealt with the JPA in Rome a few years ago with Gustavo and other colleagues. We had to provide a report on what could be the consequences when what was a communication or directive? It was a communication, I think, when it was actually enacted. Somebody asked us to provide our views on what could happen. Now, I was dealing with the economic, potential economic consequences of this. And one question, I would have many questions, but one question that I would like to ask it was concerning the price differentials that could be considered when you centralize everything in the hands of the European Commission in this particular case. So if you have a bunch of countries participating in a GPA, and you have different standards of living, different different potential per capita income in different countries, what is it going to happen? I mean, if you have a single lot, say a big contract for the whole Europe, is this going to be a single price, or are you going to take, when you do the GPA, into account the differentials across countries, etc., etc.? This is just one of the many And in particular, with the ventilators, which I didn't know about, it was very interesting to know that there was a GPA on ventilators. If you can take that, if you know the case, and if you can take that as an example to say something about this price differentials, it would be very nice.
That's a very good and a very difficult question. I think that the JPA doesn't say anything itself about how the prices should be structured. So it could be possible to design the tender to ask the suppliers to offer a price per country. And then they could try to be more competitive where they think they can be competitive. And I guess it would be quite complicated to come up with a scoring system for trading off prices across jurisdictions. So I think that's very complicated. What I would expect is that there will be a leveling up. Unfortunately, I think probably what's going to happen is that suppliers will not want to take the financial hit of keeping their price differentials. They will want to sell at the highest price that they can to the Commission. So I think there's scope for a negative economic impact of the coordination, unless the steering committee were the one to decide what is the maximum price based on the cheap jurisdictions, and then see if the sellers are willing to go for that or not. I think there's some issues. For example, the JPA for the PPE, for the personal protection equipment, which is the one that I have seen an award notice for, was deserted. So they either didn't receive any offer or none of the offers were acceptable. And I wonder if one of the things was price, because the other day in a separate Zoom conversation led by Professor Eukins from George Washington, our colleague Gianluigi Albano was saying that they have seen an increase of 70 times the price of PPE per unit. So they were buying masks 70 times cheaper 3 months ago than they do now. And I wonder if that could be one of the problems. So I guess you're right. There's a very big problem in price differentials, but I think there's also even a very big problem in price inflation. So it could be that even in the short window of time that it takes to carry out this procurement, the markets go so crazy that the maximum price the Commission would be willing to take under the JPA is already out of touch. So
yeah,
I don't know.
I was wondering how we can cope at European level with those countries who have lower per capita income. If the sellers are very keen to sell at very high prices to richer countries only, then the Eastern European would be twice disadvantaged in some sense, because there would be no price differentials on the one hand, and on the other hand, they couldn't pay perhaps for very high prices. So I was just wondering, if there was some kind of avenue taken by the European Commission on this, on how to take care of potential purchasing power differences in purchasing power from different countries. Thank you very much, Albert. And, congratulations again for the presentation, which was really remarkable.
Thank you.
Albert, before I give the floor to Sheikh Na, who has a question, I wanted to know, what is the empirics of all this? How much has been done under JPA? Do we have a number? How many tenders? How much? What kind of amount? What successes? What failures?
So I haven't had the time to look at the statistics, but I think it's been used in very few occasions. I think before this crisis, it was probably only used once or twice, I think. And in this crisis, the ones that have been public are 2 JPA efforts, one on PPE and one on ventilators. And the public information is that the PPE failed, but the ventilators were successful. So it looks at about a 50% rate. But of course, all the information is only about awards. It's not about implementation. So I don't think we have a lot of information, but that's something that we can look at in more detail. You know how difficult it is to pull information from TED. But we can try to do it after. Maybe that's something for a blog post.
What do you know about ventilators? So
the European Commission announced, but I have not been able to find the award notice, that the ventilators was successful, and that they were hoping that deliveries would be available to member states within 2 weeks from the announcement. I think the announcement is from 2 days ago or 3 days ago.
Thank you so much. Sheikh Na.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you. Hello. Thank you for the presentation. Be clear. My question is, my name is Sheikh Na Amalanjai. Sheikh Na, I'm from Senegal. I'm economist PhD. Okay. My question is related to the sovereignty, economic sovereignty of UK, about the joint cross-border procurement. Is the following: does in some extent does GPA preserve economic sovereignty of UK? What was the impact or the forecast impact of GPA in the UK markets? And that is, in summary, my question.
Okay.
The impact, does it, the reason, the fundamental reason which UK refused to enter in this program? Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's a good question. I think there are two answers to your question. Whether is the economic sovereignty preserved by the JPA? I think that the economic sovereignty of the UK, but of every other state that signs the JPA, is protected, because signing the JPA doesn't commit you to participate in any specific procurement. So for every specific procurement, you have to decide to participate. You have to decide what's the volume that you want to spend through the JPA, and that gives you a seat in the second tier steering committee. So you could just sit out from the procurement like the UK did, and that's maybe the most extreme sovereignty decision. But you could also craft the way in which you participate in terms of the volumes that you expect, and you will have votes on the decisions. And of course, the decisions are not taken by unanimity. The decisions are taken by common accord as a first approach, so that they try to reach a consensus. Failing that, it's qualified majority. So yes, you could participate and end up outnumbered or outvoted by the other member states, but I think that's part of the trade-off in participating in the coordinated effort. Now, what's going to be the impact in the UK market? Well, for now, zero, because they decided not to participate. And I think that's maybe what I was trying to hint at in terms of industrial policy. So basically, the 30,000 ventilators that the UK government wanted to buy have a market value of, it's difficult to foresee, but maybe about 250 million pounds or a bit more than that, it's a big chunk of money. And that's maybe what they were after. So what they wanted is to ring fence that investment for UK companies, trying to put that money into the UK economy. Now, this is pure speculation. I just say that on the basis of what I've seen them doing in other areas. But that's also a bit weird, because, for example, one of the big chunks of the contract went to Dyson, and Dyson had announced in the context of Brexit that they were delocalizing all of their production and moving it to Singapore. So if by not participating in the JPA, the UK intended to channel money to the UK economy, and a third of those ventilators end up being manufactured in Singapore, or even if they are manufactured in the UK, they're manufactured with loads of components that come from supply chains from outside of the UK, then I would argue that's a short-sighted industrial policy, and that it could have come at a cost, because the UK doesn't know what advantages they could have gotten from the JPA. Now, I said it a bit quickly, but participating in the JPA doesn't prevent you from also engaging your own processes domestically. So if the UK had wanted to be super, super savvy, what I think they should have done is get into the JPA, in parallel, run their own approaches to their preferred domestic suppliers, and at the end of the game, with all of the information, make their own decisions. probably that comes even at the higher cost of not participating in terms of reputation for the country. But I'm not sure that's a very relevant cost given the stakes.
Could we have the studies which the UK fund his decision to not accept to enter it?
To be honest, I don't know if there are any such studies. I would be quite amazed if given how quickly these things moved, they carried out lots of analysis, and whatever analysis exists certainly has not been made public as far as I know.
Good. Thank you very much.
No problem.
Albert, thank you. Albert, while I'm going to leave now the floor to Sonia for her question, there is a question on the chat room by user 57. Maybe you want to answer that very quickly. Isn't it time to think of regulation of extremely high prices in case of extreme situations like pandemia and so on? This is a more, obviously, it's a larger question.
Yeah, I mean, if I tackle that one very quickly, I would say yes, it's time to rethink it. But the problem here is that it would only be effective if you were to do it on a global basis, because the supply chains are very global. But I said the other day, I think my concern now is that the markets are not working. This is clearly one of the situations where there's a market failure. There's too little capacity to meet demand, which means it puts almost every seller in a quasi monopolistic position for each of the contracts that they're trying to tender. There's very limited view. So I would be in favor of regulation of price, but my worry is that the implementation of that maybe just requires nationalization of the production mechanisms and a global agreement on trading on cost basis, probably on humanitarian ground. So I would be all for it. I just think it's maybe very complicated to do on the fly. So that's why, again, I think long term for the next pandemic, which will come, so the only question is when, but not if, maybe we want to be ready in that regard and avoid those issues of cross-border buyers competition.
Sonia.
Thank you. Sonia Ben Salem from Tunisia. I have 3 short questions. The first one, in accordance to this experience, is it okay?
Yeah.
Is it okay? Okay. Okay. In accordance to this experience, did we achieve our goals, satisfaction of needs in time, and we ensure the quality and the prices? The second question is about the criteria to choose the suppliers to be run through this GPA. And the third question, what are the reasons? Because I think the GPA experience isn't very rich. What are the reasons why they aren't another experience in the GPA? Thank you.
Three very good questions, to which I think I don't have very good answers. On the first one, did we achieve the goals? Well, on the ventilators, on paper, yes. So there are contracts and there's an expectation of delivery. But I think this will only be able to be an ex post fact analysis. So as you know, the award of the contract, that doesn't tell us the whole story. We need to wait for implementation. And unfortunately, this is going to be a very long-winded and very problematic implementation of contracts. So this is something for 2022 or 2023, and for hardcore economists to answer. I'm not in a very good position. On the criteria to choose, I haven't seen them, but the criteria are established by the steering committee of the second tier and implemented by the European Commission. I'm guessing in this case, what I think they probably went for was sort of an American approach to lowest price, technically compliant, so that they probably set up the threshold of the technical requirements where they think it needs to be, and then just went for commercial offer. That would be my guess in terms of trying to move forward and go quick, but I might be wrong. And then on the reasons for the limited use of the JPA, it's because it's a very exceptional mechanism. So it's only for a reaction to very serious cross-border threats to human health, which luckily we haven't had those many in recent years. So this was created in 2010 after the SARS pandemic. and this is the next pandemic as far as I know. So that's why it's been very limited or not used at all. But is it going to be used more in the future? Maybe, particularly if countries now take it seriously to have a proper contingency planning and proper equipment. Maybe this is a way of doing it in a coordinated manner outside of emergency times, that the JPA is not only for emergency times, but it's mainly activated when there's a cross-border need. So we'll see if there is more appetite for cross-border collaboration.
Thank you, Albert. Before giving the floor to Nicolas, I wanted to ask you, what is your judgment on the transparency at all levels, the legal one, the communication one, of all this? Because from what you say, sometimes I get a perception that there is transparency and sometimes not.
Well, I think this is a very tricky procurement, right, in terms of the transparency of it, because there are specific issues I wouldn't want to disclose in this procurement. Particularly, I wouldn't want to disclose reservation prices. I wouldn't want to disclose conditions. So this looked like a procurement that is mainly being implemented through direct negotiations with potential suppliers. And if that's the case, then those are by definition non-transparent procurements. I would not worry about this. I don't think these are the sort of mechanisms where you need loads of stakeholder scrutiny just because of the conditions which they carry out. What is going to be important is to have transparency exposed. So what I think is going to be very important is to have the audit offices, and maybe in this case, the appropriate one is the European Court of Auditors, to send some, get some information requests out and then publish some reports for mutual learning and dissemination of the experience. But I am comfortable with this not being done in a very transparent way at this stage. I don't think that the member states doing things separately would be more transparent at all if all of them rely on the direct awards without publication. So I don't think we would be better off without the JPA than we are under it.
Nicolas.
Hello, hello everybody. Thank you for such a nice presentation. I have basically two questions and one remark. So can non-EU member states benefit from GPA, and these non-EU member states might be associated member states like Georgia? And so the question is if Georgia can benefit from these contracts signed under GPA. And the second question is that is there any eligibility restrictions in terms of nationality of the suppliers, meaning do only EU-based European suppliers can participate and win the contract, or is it open like worldwide to anyone? And I would ask Master Secretariat, so if it's technically possible, let's say today I had the time and I have the chance to participate in this meeting, but like in future, if I don't have time, maybe Master Secretariat send some links where I can find the record of the videos that you make. Thank you.
Yes, Albert, sorry, just let me come in on the second question. Obviously, first of all, let me say hello to all the alumni and the alumni association members. Also, let me say that yes, this, for example, the video of today will be both on Albert's blog, right, Albert?
Yes.
And on the blog of the IMPPM, which is on the website, I'm sorry, masterprocurement.eu, and all the next ones are going to be taped and put on the website of the master itself. Sorry, Albert.
No, that's all right. So on the first question on who can join, it's not only open to EU member states, it's also open to EEA states and states that have a neighboring agreement with the European Union. But the problem for EEA and countries with a neighboring agreement is that they have to enter into a further agreement about this. So EU member states can join automatically, but for the others to join, it's necessary to have a separate agreement. on their participation, and it's not open to any other third countries. In terms of who can participate in the GPA as a potential supplier, then the rules of the financial regulation apply. And what the financial regulation says is that basically every country that is covered by either the WTO GPA or by a bilateral agreement that is applicable in the EU can participate. So for example, Canadian companies or Singaporean companies could participate because there's a free trade agreement with them. Same thing with Georgia, Moldova, or Ukraine, because they have the deep and comprehensive free trade agreements. The difficulty here, and that's a bit of a pickle, is that it has to be covered as all those agreements are covered. So it will not only be necessary for the country to be covered, but also by the specific supplies to be covered. And for example, in healthcare, the coverage is different in different free trade agreements. So it would depend on the specific conditions applicable in each of those countries.
Thank you.
I have Ali Ab now. Ali.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me?
We can hear you and see you. Great.
Yeah, my name is Ali Abbani from Lebanon. First of all, it's great to stay connected in spite of all the problems around us, thanks to Mr. Pig and the University of Rome to Vergata. My question is to Mr. Albert. Didn't you think that suppliers regarding GPA would be biased to their original countries in terms of fulfilling more quantities of the demands, especially in light of high shortage in the medical goods worldwide?
That's a very good question, and that's specifically addressed in the JPA. So the JPA in Article 17 says that the quantity and the time that each of the member states receives is subject to approval of the steering committee. So it could be that they decide to do it pro rata of the volumes, or it could be that they decide that for speediness, they split it. So imagine you have a JPA with 3 providers of ventilators, one in Germany, one in France, and one in Italy. What they could say is, let's split the participating countries in 3 zones, depending on what's closer to what. So for example, the French provides to France, Spain, Portugal, the German provides Central Europe, and Italy provides the rest of the South, or something like this. So they can agree on that, but that is specifically regulated in the specific agreement of the second level steering committee, and the suppliers have to comply with that, and the member states have to comply with that. And that's precisely, I think, to avoid the moral hazard that you're identifying, which is the domestic supplier being put under pressure to satisfy the needs of the domestic population first. There is all sorts of very complicated ethical issues about that, and I don't think now we have the time to address them. But at least from a legal perspective, it's very clear in Article 17 that's a specific schedule of times and volumes that is going to be agreed.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ali. What you make me think, Albert, that given all these complications, the combinatorial offers would be a nice way to allow greater participation, so that you wouldn't have, fixed lots that would maybe decrease the amount of possible participation because of the size, but leave every one of the suppliers to evaluate whether to participate to 1 lot, 2 lots, 3 lots, make combinatorial offers.
Yes, that's a good point.
Yeah. Imawan.
Yes, thank you, Professor. My name is Imawan Giri Dahlan from Indonesia. First of all, I want to congratulations about your great presentations. And my question is, as far as I know, because this agreement is not exclusive, how does GPA handle possible deviations from a member states or even foreign country that will possibly disrupt the supply of goods, especially in these urgent situations? Thank you.
That's a good question. So from the participating countries, it is true that they are not prevented from carrying out their own procurement, but once they participate in a procurement, they are bound by a good faith requirement, which means, I mean, it's a bit open, but for example, one of the things that they could not do is get the information on which providers have been selected and under which conditions, and then go and negotiate with them to try to jeopardize the European effort. Of course, this would trigger all sorts of issues that I think law is a bit incapable of dealing with in a satisfactory manner, because there's no point in having a judgment from the Court of Justice in 4 years saying that there was a breach. These are very practical issues, and it's problematic, but at least there's that mechanism. With third countries, there's nothing they can do. So if say a shipment of ventilators has to come from, let's just give a silly example, but from Austria to France, and they are driving through Switzerland, and the Swiss decide to just size the ventilators and keep them, there's nothing you can do under the JPA. This just becomes a WTO law issue, as far as I know. And in this day and age where we don't have a WTO dispute settlement body in operation, mainly that means it's the Wild West. I think the only thing we can hope for is that that all states will be responsible, and even if they have very significant pressures to try to cope with the needs of their own population, that they will not disrupt the international order by being that maverick. But to be honest, with the number of populist governments we have in place, I'm a bit pessimistic personally.
Sorry, Albert, I was just reading a question by Roger Bickerstaff. Does Albert know about further JPA projects in the pipeline?
I know that that's open, but I'm not aware of any. So I don't think there's public information about those. I don't know if Roger has heard anything more specific that he could share.
Roger, you want to?
No, not currently. It seems to me that given the current situation, and particularly with there's quite a lot of press reports in the UK about the US, as Albert says, acting as some sort of pirate, in the world market. So it seems that there's quite a lot of need for increasing coordination on as widespread level as possible. So I would hope that this is not a program which is coming to a standstill, but which is developing and creating its own initiative and its own momentum.
Thank you. Albert, I wanted to ask you something. You mentioned before that one of the reasons to justify decentralization was possibly, you put a question mark there, was speed, right? At the same time, the construction of this mechanism makes us think that maybe there's less speed and more complexity that would maybe justify why this instrument in emergencies maybe has not been used as we expected. What is your opinion on that?
I think that the steering committee can be pretty swift. So as I said, they try to operate on common accord, but if things get to a standstill, then they can just put it to qualified majority voting. And I think it's a bit difficult to know if it's going to be slower or quicker than at domestic level. But some of the tasks that need to be carried out, like defining the technical specs, thinking about how to divide lots, how to evaluate, are pretty much the same, whether you do it at any scale, right? So it's just because you're carrying out one procurement. So that's an amount of time that is just common to any decision-making procedure. The difficulty would be in having to agree upon them. That's the only level. But I think it could be much higher speed for some member states that may not have these expertise. So for example, if you put me now to try to figure this out, it's going to take me ages because I know nothing about ventilators. It could be some countries don't have experts on ventilators. So for them, it's much quicker to rely on a common effort if some of the countries bring in the expertise. So that could be a difference. The other thing is about how quickly you can negotiate. So if I am a seller and I'm sitting on a stock of 100 ventilators, probably I want to run a beauty contest, right? I'm not going to agree with you just because you called me first. I'm going to wait for the calls of the other 26 and see who's the one that pays me more and more upfront, and which one persuades me better. So it could actually speed up the negotiations by just having one conversation going on rather than 26. This is all complicated game theory. I'm just speculating, but I think it could cut both ways. I don't think we need to assume that just because there's a collective element in the steering committee that's going to slow things down. I think also every member state is going to be very keen on not being the one holding things up. So if anything, the vetoes are going to be very minimal, I would think. They would just drop out, I would imagine, rather than hold things up.
One final question, since we draw to the 1 hour limit. Imagine that there is an important supplier from China. Would at the legal level and at the buying power level, would, in your opinion, the JPA change something into the dynamics of how of the conclusion of the deal, or in no way?
I think it could, if there's one big supplier that is important, then yes, because then it's more an issue of bilateral bargaining power, and all of the volumes aggregated are going to be more important than 26 smaller orders, probably. So supplying Europe is more important than supplying Spain. So I think that could make a change. The other thing that could make a change is that, for example, the guidelines on access to European procurements from third countries and all the pressure the European Commission has been putting on trying to minimize that, particularly from India and China. I don't think the European Commission is going to play games now. So it's clear the Commission is going to just try to go and get the supplies, whereas the member states could just be worried, am I going to be in legal trouble if I'm supplying from China at this stage? So I think it also would take one element of legal uncertainty out of the table.
Thank you so much, Albert. It's been a wonderful conversation. This was much more than a pill. It was a very welcome medicine for all of us.
Hope nobody gets digested.
It has been live and it will be digested later on. So let me say again, you want to remind everybody of your blog title, so that the blog name, so we know where to find it on your blog and actually where to read you.
Yeah, so you will find this on How to Crack a Nut as soon as I can upload it, and also on Twitter. So you can look it through my Twitter handle that was in the presentation. And thank you all again for the participation. Just to say, because it's been recorded and it's going to be uploaded, I take it everybody agrees that their names, faces, voices are usable. If that's not the case, please let me know as soon as possible, because that would be a bit of a compliance issue for me. But thank you very much. I have learned a lot from your questions, and I look forward to more conversations.
And we look forward to seeing you again. Okay. Thank you, Albert. Thank you,
everybody.
to all, and see you very soon.
Thank you.